Hi. So let's talk about emotional dysregulation in borderline personality disorder. Now, this is very common in individuals along that BPD spectrum. And emotional dysregulation isn't just one issue. It's not just one thing. There's actually four components. And this comes from Marsha Linehan's Biosocial model. And she was the individual that developed Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, which is an efficacious treatment for BPD. But let's talk about emotional dysregulation. This is when you become so emotionally overwhelmed that it impacts your thoughts, behaviors, intent, and how you manage and act within a variety of situations externally, but also internally. Well, let's talk about these four components. Now, the four components are emotional sensitivity, heightened and labile negative affect, and it's a deficit in appropriate regulation strategies, and it's a surplus of maladaptive regulation strategies. So let's see. Let's talk about emotional sensitivity. Now, individuals along that BPD spectrum, they have a heightened sensitivity to emotional reactions. Now, a lot of the research shows that individuals with BPD, that they tend to perceive pretty neutral stimulus as threatening, as ominous. And what that does is it sends a signal that there's harm, that there's danger, that there's issue or threat. And that increases their physiological response of being hurt. They start to protect themselves. But because, and these four components we're going to talk about, they're not mutually exclusive. They all work together. And because of these other components, we see that it quickly becomes this tornado of emotions, affect, perception. And that emotion sensitivity, we can really look at that and recognize, as I just mentioned, but the distortion is also at play. It's that BPD distortion. And where does that distortion come from? Well, that distortion that impacts your emotions and the emotional sensitivity comes from our core content. And that's that content that's inside the individual. And it could be classic BPD core content is emotional sensitivity, could be fear of abandonment, and could be emptiness. Now there's others, and a lot of individuals have their own as well, but those are kind of the classic ones that I've seen in my experience, as well as it's certainly mentioned in the research as being prominent. But you have your own as well. And these core components, what they do is they add to that surface content, which in this case, what we're talking about is emotional sensitivity. You're sensitive to emotions. You're sensitive for issues and factors that are attributable to someone leaving you, someone never wanting to see you again, someone rejecting you, you not getting your needs met. I had a client many years ago, and we were talking about an instance that was related to a pen in his home. And he was looking for a pen in his home. So he couldn't find one, couldn't find a pen. Why aren't there any pens? Where could this be? Where could this be? And talking to his partner, he said, why aren't there any pens? Where are these pens? How do we not have pens? And that created, again, goes back to that emotional tornado, just spinning and spinning and spinning. And it exploded into this massive action, reaction, problems in the relationship that were, of course, already there. So he comes into me and we're sitting down and we're processing what happened. And we're talking about emotional sensitivity, right? So he was sensitive to that issue. And I said, well, let's kind of break it down. And as we're talking, he tells me, and I'll never forget this, he tells me, if we don't have a pen, then I don't have what I need. If I don't have what I need, then how am I going to be able to take care of myself? How am I going to have a home? How am I going to be able to feed myself? I'm going to be destitute, alone, with nothing, homeless, starving on the streets. And when we talk about outside of context, we think, really? Just because there's a pen? How did we get to being homeless and starving? But that's part of BPD. It's part of that distortion, that emotional tornado, that emotional sensitivity that can set things off, set things in motion, just as it did for him. Now, the next component let's talk about that heightened and labile negative affect. Anger, rage, fear, doubt, guilt, shame, all of that heightened negative affect. Affect is another term for emotions, right? Feelings. And labile. When we're talking about labile negative affect, we're talking about sort of a very fluid sense. It changes. It can be up, it can be down, it can be flat, it could be very intense, it could be missing almost, feel like there's a sense of void. And that heightened and labile negative affect within BPD, we see again, comes from that emotional sensitivity, is absolutely driven by the core content. So an example of that negative labile affect, what we see is that suddenly there's all these changes, right? Idealization, devaluation, and the individual cannot always identify what that emotion is. So they feel these strong and intense emotions. Could be sadness, could be frustration, could be, again, anger, rage, whatever it may be. And we see that as it changes and it becomes negative, it builds in that emotional tornado. It adds to the complexity, which brings us next to it is a deficit in appropriate regulation strategies, and there's a surplus of maladaptive regulation strategies. So what we see is there's no appropriate regulation strategy, which I call adaptive regulation strategies, and there is many, or a surplus, more than you need, of maladaptive beliefs, behaviors, and patterns. And what happens is that when you are emotionally sensitive, you have that heightened and labile negative affect, all of these emotions, you're spinning, and your emotions are dysregulated, right? They're off course. What do? Well, BPD, because it's also part of this family in the head that I talk about as well, and it's that family head, that chorus is telling you that this is it, this is ruined, nobody loves you, nobody cares about you, and you feel this sense of sadness. So how do you manage it? Typically in BPD is that you slide backwards these beliefs, behaviors, and patterns to deal with it and try to resolve it as quickly as possible. It's not about it being effective, it's about getting it off, right? It's like this tarantula or this poisonous spider, black widow spider jumps on your hand and you're like, get it off, get it off, get it off. And it's the same type of thing. You don't process and think, wait, if I try to get that black widow spider off my hand, it could then bite me. So you don't think about it. It's an immediate, feels like almost an immediate. It's this drive, this instinctual, emotional drive to get it off. And it's the same thing for those with BPD. It's this being overwhelmed. Well, if that's all you got, get it off. And the get it off can be self-harm, can be impulsive, risky behaviors, alcohol, drugs, promiscuity. It can also be a lot of self-harm. It can be threatening others, physical violence, whatever it may be. And those things add to and increase the probability of negative outcome, of problems down the road. And it feeds that BPD, because reality is that when you get it off, sometimes you're going to get it off. And sometimes you're going to be like, whew, I got it. But what that does, it strengthens the maladaptive pattern. And the maladaptive pattern feeds into your BPD, increases the likelihood that you're going to use maladaptive beliefs, behaviors, and patterns to manage situations. In this case, we're talking about emotion dysregulation, to manage that emotional sensitivity, which puts you at a heightened risk to have intensive emotional reactions, as we talked about, and to have that labile negative affect. So all of this starts spinning together, and it reinforces that BPD, which is what creates what we call personality disorders, that borderline personality disorder. It helps to create it because it becomes prolonged. These maladaptive patterns become prolonged. So then you realize, okay, so what else can I do? Are there other strategies or the regulation strategies that I can do to manage my emotions? Well, in this model that we're talking about and in this approach to emotion dysregulation, you don't really have any. What kind of adaptive strategies can you use? Well, there's a lot that you can use. A mental health provider can help you identify those. One of them is to identify your core content, which is what I do with my clients. Then we identify that surface content. Where's your go-to? What are your go-to strategies? They're typically maladaptive. Let's find some adaptive strategies that you can utilize. What are some things that you can do differently? So how can you get that black widow spider off your hand without it being frightened and biting you? What else can you do? And it's about identifying those various strategies. I have a lot of videos on managing these various strategies and things like that. And I think that you could definitely get a lot of help from checking those out. I'll put some links here that might be able to help you, some tips and strategies. But recognizing this emotion dysregulation and taking a look at it and seeing where you fall on it can really, really be helpful in managing not only your emotions, but getting control over your BPD. And don't forget, BPD is the most successfully treated personality disorder. So you can absolutely deal with it, handle it, manage it, and do your life differently. So I hope this was helpful for you, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.